Welcome to Cloud on Air, live webinars from Google Cloud. We're hosting webinars every Tuesday. My name's Mark Jordan, and today I'll be talking to you about adding customer identity and access management to your application using Cloud Identity for customers and partners. You can ask questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. So let's get started. So we've got a jam-packed agenda for you today. And we'll take you through sort of a couple of key elements of customer identity and why it's important for your application. What I'll be discussing is sort of why your app needs to add a truly robust and secure and scalable customer identity solution. And then towards the end, we'll get deep into the weeds and talk about how you can take an application and add CICP to it. So we'll talk about, are customer identities really that different? Adding security to your application without adding obscurity. Dropping in SDKs rather than dropping out because of all the complexity. And then we'll talk more in detail about Google's cloud solution called CICP. So are customer identities really that different? They absolutely are. When you think about things like scale, the number of consumers or partners that might have to log into your application versus traditional employee use cases, we see massive magnitudes of difference. The experience that's expected is completely different. Security posture, security factors, all of these things are also completely different to traditional employee identity and access management use cases. And finally, diversity. Think of the diverse population of users around the world, around the globe, trying to access your application and to get things done. So let's dive into each of these in a little bit of detail. So down the bottom here, I've listed some sort of fairly randomized but real use cases of customer versus employee counts for accounts in a system. And you can see the little blue lines down the bottom there. The employee count for these organizations, for these large corporations, is dwarfed by the sometimes up to billions of users that are accessing applications hosted by them. So let's zoom in here just a little bit and have a look. As you can see, even the largest organization here is dealing with sort of 500,000 or 600,000 employees. But when you're talking about billions of customers or billions of partners, really the traditional IAM systems that you've been using don't cut it. And so you need a better way. You need something more equipped to deal with this volume of users, this volume of traffic, and the needs that these users have. So, as I said, employees for the most part, they've got apps delivered via their IT department. Think about when you've sort of started a new company, you get a selection of applications, a selection of services, and that's what you're using through your day, sort of company mandated applications. Now this is changing a little bit, but it's nowhere near the extent that customers have. And so when we look at customers, when we look at consumers, they don't necessarily have an IT department to configure their applications. They don't have a help desk on hand to start to field their sort of questions and concerns and problems that they might be having. In many cases, they've got to do it alone. And so you've got to make it really easy for them to onboard, as well as to continue to use your service. We find that long forms, confusing experiences, they introduce fatigue, they introduce cognitive overload. And as we'll go through this, you'll see some very real examples where this happens. And the last thing you want to do as a provider of a customer solution is to get your user blocked at the very first thing they're trying to do, to sign up for an account to get access to your application or service. And finally, for consumer apps, user experience is king. If there's friction, if there's problems, if it doesn't work properly on their device, they might get flustered or get angry or whatever the case may be, and just not adopt your application. Go to a competitor, leave, and you don't see the full value out of them as a customer, and they don't get the full value out of the services you might be offering. So really, we see this as sort of the on-road to get customers access to your application or service. Now, when we look at security, things are also very different. I'm sure many of you, you have a job, you work at a large enterprise or a corporation or something like that, and you have things like smart cards, you might have mobile apps that do push or one-time passwords. At Google, we use security keys so that our credentials are completely unphishable. But many of these things just aren't applicable to to customer use cases. And so think about the last time you logged into your bank or to some other service that was security sensitive. Traditionally, you use things like SMS multi-factor, use email multi-factor, and sometimes even security questions. So really, the security posture for customer security is much lower, but it's focused on how can I help this person adopt my service and still have a reasonable level of security. So through, when we look at the lens of enterprise security versus customer security, the postures are very different. And finally, diversity. Customers and partners, as I've spoken about already, they look very different to employees. They're not just focused in sort of a few geographic locations in big offices and things like that. They could be coming from anywhere. They could have diverse backgrounds, diverse sets of devices. Some people may have smartphones, the latest and greatest smart device. They may be using just feature phones or that only have sort of text message capabilities and things like that. They have different access methods and different usage patterns and needs. So while an employee might come in sort of from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., you'll find that consumer applications traditionally get accessed at all times of night, don't see this same routine passage of access. And most importantly, remember that customers and partners have chosen you. They've chosen your application, they've chosen your service, not the reverse. And so, keeping them on your platform, making sure they have this lovely on-road to get access to your services is your responsibility. And you should be in the best footing, in the best stead to be able to provide that to them. So, how do we do some of this? How do we provide security without obscurity? Now, I could put countless newspaper headlines up here. And I'm sure you've all seen it. Every day, every time you open the paper, you'll see a new breach has happened. One just a couple of weeks ago and one a couple of weeks before that. Huge data breaches involving hundreds of millions of users. And so, as the custodian of customer accounts, it's really important that you put yourself in a position where you can prevent or detect or respond to these sort of events before they make front page news. And then, even at Google, when we look at our consumer services, we find that less than 10% of Google accounts have two-factor authentication enabled. And so we need to be better at providing easy to use, easy to onboard solutions that provide these strong authentication factors. Even then, we also see that across America, about 12% of users actually have password managers. And the alternative to this is frequently people set the same password across all of their applications and services. Generally pretty simple passwords, something that's easy to crack, and it means that if I've potentially got a password in one system, I might have access to all of your systems if they don't have 2FA enabled. And importantly, if you add friction, it may hurt adoption of your service. And so, based on some surveys that we've observed, 56% of people have not signed up to an app or service because the sign up was too long, too complex, too difficult. They've dropped out as part of that process. 49% have stopped using an app because the login process was too time consuming. So they've created an account, they've onboarded into your application, but they don't keep coming back because it's too hard to get on, too hard to get access to the services that you're offering. So these are points of friction that we want to be able to reduce and be able to improve people, not just first time coming to your application, but also staying customers for life and using your service. So that being the case, is security versus adoption really a choice? Like, can I only have my cake versus eating my cake? We don't think that's the case, and we want to sort of come up with a better way, a solution that enables people to adopt your platform, to be secure, to love the services that you're offering. So there's a few things here that we recommend, and I'll dive into these in a little bit of detail. First, anonymous accounts and upgrade. The second, being more social, supporting providers out there on the web. Importantly, listening to risk signals. If something doesn't look right, if something doesn't smell right, maybe you should pay attention to it and start to respond to that to ensure that your accounts aren't going to be compromised or breached or worse. And finally, auth, re-authentication, and two-factor authentication. Really, really important. So, for me, as an identity professional, I download apps, I consume services and things like that. And the one thing that always gets me is the first time I install an application, it might say, I need you to sign up for an account. Or worse, I need full access to your device. I want to be able to look at your photos and your messages and all these sorts of things. Even before I've had a chance to experience the application, I'm asked to be giving the developer my personal information or information that I might find sensitive. And we think that's a bad direction to head if you're building an application. And so we support anonymous users, and we believe that can increase the initial adoption of your application or service. So I load up the application, it doesn't ask me for anything, I start to use it, I start to get a feel for it, and then once I've fallen in love with it, once I find that this does everything that I need, I might then prompt the user to upgrade that account, maintaining all of their same state, maintaining their user ID and all these sorts of things, so that then they can get more benefit from the app. Really about earning trust. And the way that we do this is we save state on the client side. So inside of the app, inside of local storage and things like that. And so we can maintain that user's user ID even from the first time they load up that application, all the way through till them, creating an account potentially or linking a social provider or whatever the case may be. And we believe that earning your users' trust is a great way to get people on in a friction-free way and keep them on as they start to progress through your service. So the next thing is, be more social. There's tons and tons of federated identity providers out there. And most importantly, why store credentials you don't need? It's proven that users don't like typing in usernames and passwords and remembering these credentials and things like that. And it's a risk for you to have a password or a credential in your database that's being used across multiple services on the web. So we say, if you can avoid it, don't do it. We've heard from our customers that this increases adoption a number of times fold, in that I just click the potentially sign in with Google button or whatever the case is. Suddenly I'm signed in, I maintain my state, I don't need to go through any confusing or difficult forms, and I have access to the application or service. Now, as I was saying, listening to risk signals is incredibly important. Any service that you build, any application that you build, should be integrating with risk and analytics streams. At Google, we have billions of daily events, and this can help us to determine what things are risky, what things are potentially putting your account system at risk of compromise, what accounts are potentially not who they say they are. And so all of these pieces of information across our search properties, across our mail properties and our login systems helps us to provide context for end users so that they can log in with safety, and we can step a user up or block a user when the time is right. And finally, authentication. So as I said, authentication via federation or local credentials is great. You want to be able to have some information about the user, but you should offer a set of primary authentication providers or primary authentication factors that make sense for your application. So, if you choose to sign in with Google, you might offer risk-based analytics on top of Google's wealth of information about that account and listen to that signal and say, well, hey, is this a real account? Is it currently free of risk and things like that before you allow the user access to your application? Now, re-authentication becomes important. So authentication shouldn't just be a one-time thing. I shouldn't just authenticate to an app and suddenly be authenticated for the rest of my life. There's things that happen through the course of an application that might make sense for me to, prompt for my username and password again, or prompt for my Google credential, or prompt for a multi-factor, OTP or something like that. Things like making a large purchase, topping up my cash amount, maybe closing my account or transferring money are all reasons that you might want to say, hey, you know what? I need you to re-authenticate. I need you to prove again who you say you are, and maybe add a strong authentication factor in there as well. And my guidance for strong authentication, or MFA, is simple. Use MFA, not too much, and mostly strong factors. So, there's a bunch of factors out there. Use the ones that make sense for your organization, that make sense for your application or whatever the service you might be building, but avoid implementing factors that cause friction, that cause drop-off, that cause people to do bad things with the way that they sign into your system. So, we've talked about a lot so far. Allowing anonymous accounts to get access to your application, then upgrade when the time seems right. To use social providers so you don't have to store credentials. Listening to risk signals so you don't have to rely on sort of a user just giving username and password to sign in. Supporting epic scale. It's not just tens of thousands of users, it's tens of millions or hundreds of millions even. And so you need to be able to support that sort of scale. You should be implementing MFA, you should have a great user experience, implement standards, and support strong authentication and re-authentication. That's a ton. And this makes your average developer, and even me, feel a little bit overwhelmed in terms of all of the things I do just to get a user in the front door. And this is before I think of all of the cool features that I want to add to my application or service. So don't be overwhelmed by this. There's solutions out there to help, and we think at Google we've got a pretty good one. So first and foremost, make sure you've got extensibility where it matters. We build this platform to ensure that you can put the pieces together in a way that makes sense for your organization. And we integrate with other functionality within Google Cloud or Google in general, things like analytics or cloud functions or Stackdriver, to enable you to get the most out of your investment in your authentication system, but then start to use all of the other applications and services that Google Cloud might have. And so you can slot things in that make sense for your application. Now, using vendor-supported SDKs does a lot of this heavy lifting for you. You don't need to understand sort of certain specifications, like I don't need to read the 100-page OAuth 2 specification. By implementing an SDK, I can make a simple call, make a simple method, and really just get a user signed in without too much fuss. And we'll dive into that in a second. You should use out-of-box sign-in and security methods that are suited for your application. Signing in with a Google account, we understand doesn't suit all applications and might not be right for your application. So, make sure that it's easy, make sure these various sign-in methods are available to you, but also make sure that they're right for your application, that you're implementing the right solution. And finally, don't reinvent sign-up and sign-in flows. These are already well-defined, well-supported, and most vendors, and Google included with CICP, have a great solution that enables you to add an SDK into your application or service without having to worry about sort of, page transitions and sign-in flows and worrying what you're going to do with a token as it goes through that flow. So, flexible SDKs are your secret weapon. Authentication isn't easy, and providing secure authentication is a life mission for us at Google. A good SDK will take the guesswork out of implementing strong and secure authentication. So let me give you a quick primer of what CICP is before I dive into the demo. So Cloud Identity for Customers and Partners is a customer identity and access management platform delivered that helps organizations secure their applications and offer strong authentication, protecting user accounts, and have confidence in what I'm building is secure and is going to allow my users to get access in the right way. So you build your application, you include all the cool functionality that you might need, slot CICP in there at the top, and then allow customers, partners, whoever might need access to your application or service to get access via CICP. We standardize all those tokens and we give you something that's useful in your application that you can reason about, that you can authorize your end users on. So we offer Google-grade authentication. It's based on widely adopted Google identity platforms. We have 8 applications with more than 1 billion users in them, and we think that we've learned, we think all of the things that we've learned enable you to build a better solution or a better application with strong identity added to it. We offer customizable open source and drop-in end user interfaces. And we have broad support of authentication protocols, client SDKs, and server SDKs. And adhering to federation protocols, adhering to standards is something that's really, really important to us to enable you to take what you have and easily implement it into our solution. We offer advanced user security, so we integrate with Google's threat intelligence signals to help detect potentially compromised user accounts. We're working on 2-factor authentication that's just around the corner and in line with our general availability release. And we're built on Google's secure infrastructure. So all of those services that are offered on top of Google's infrastructure, this is another one of them that's protected by sort of DDoS protection and against our standard set of API protections. So we think that's really, really important to ensure that your application, your authentication system is available at Google scale. And as I said, planet scale infrastructure means that we can offer amazing performance globally. There's no notion of deploying sort of sharded infrastructure throughout the world. Google does that for you, and we can offer incredibly, incredibly responsive services wherever you are in the world. We have integration with things like Cloud Functions, with Firebase, with Stackdriver, with all of these other bits and pieces that Google's cloud offers. And we have enterprise-grade support and availability SLAs in our general availability release that will enable you to be safe, secure, and trust that Google has your back to build this authentication system. So let's dive to the demo. So here's Google Cloud Platform, and I've got customer identity here, but this is something that I've pinned to my home screen. So to find CICP, what I can do is go to the GCP marketplace and search for any number of things, but we'll just call it CICP for now. And I have this cloud identity for customers and partners. And this will enable me to enable it for my project to enable this strong authentication system. So let's dive to my pre-configured one already. And you can see I'm greeted with all the providers I have enabled for my service. I've just got a few enabled here, but there's a lot more that we support. And so adding sort of enterprise federation standards, adding social providers, adding things like username and password, or even better, passwordless authentication, are all things that we support out of the box. I've got a rich representation of my users that enable me to reason about what users are in my system, the last time they signed in, the user IDs that they're bringing with them, as well as some configuration around sort of, what do I want email templates to look, where do my applications live, and how do I want to handle things like duplicated accounts coming from two different sign-in methods. Maybe I want to link them together or do something else. So this is the application, this is the service. But when I talk to developers, they're like, well, I'm building my application. I don't need UIs. I want to do it via SDKs. And so as I was saying previously, we've got a rich set of SDKs as well. And so what we find is that most people get started and they say, well, I've got an application already. I've got a user database. How do I get this into CICP? So let me take you through that journey. So I'm going to spend some time in my IDE here. And you can see the very first thing I'm doing is I'm going to look at this SQL database that I have on premise. So let's quickly do that. And when that finishes up, you'll see that I've got a set of accounts here inside of my SQL database that have access to my application already. Now, I've just got a few here, but traditionally we see developers have hundreds of millions of accounts potentially in their user database. And they say, well, I've got this database filled with users. They've got these hashed passwords. How do I get them out of my SQL database and into CICP? And that's pretty easy. So with our rich set of SDKs, what I'm able to do is query this SQL database, and then I'm able to grab the users and import them into CICP. And so really all we ask you to do is tell us how you've hashed those passwords. In this case, I'm using bcrypt to hash the passwords in my SQL database. And what I can do is I can then pick those users up and import them into CICP. So let's quickly do that. I'll give that a couple of seconds. And if I flick back to my identity solution here and give it a quick refresh, you see that those 3 new accounts have been created. So I've picked up those accounts with their existing passwords and migrated them into our database. And so we think that's kind of interesting. But now that I've got these into my application, how do I use these users? How do I transition these users into CICP users and start to use the application that I'm building on top of it? So let's go to a real example. Here I've got a login page that I've created myself, and so our logon widget is completely customizable. I've customized the logo here, I've customized some text and all of the other contents, as well as my terms of service and privacy policy. I've customized the background, but the sky's the limit. You can do whatever you want with CSS, with the JS and things like that. And we offer this library for web, for Android, and for iOS. So let me sign in with one of the accounts that I just created here. And I'll bring up my developer tools as well. And I'll sign in with the account that I migrated into the system as well. And so you can see I've verified the password and now I'm authenticated. And what I've done here is I've created a pretty simple application and it's showing what the contents of my token are. So you can see it's been issued by this secure token endpoint that runs on Google's scalable infrastructure. I've got an audience that represents my GCP project, as well as other claims about my identity. So, how have I signed in, what my email address is and anything in addition to that. But what I traditionally hear from developers is, well, that's great, that's a basic user identity, but I need to be able to, tell if that user's paid their subscription fee or if they're a free user or what their status is. And so we support that with something that we call custom claims or custom attributes. And so let me go to my custom claims here. And what I'll do is I just logged in with this marge@cloudonair.com. And what I can do is I can say Marge's role, in this case, is admin. Or let me just call her Marge a guest in this case. So let's set that custom claim on Marge. Great. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign in as Marge one more time. And great. Now you can see that Marge brings in a role of guest. Now you don't need to force the user to sign in and out. You can sort of do a re-authentication, do a token reissuance and things like that. But that's an easy way for us to be able to add custom claims or custom attributes to a user object so that they can then pick up their JSON web token and take it with them to an application. So I've shown you what's in the JOT. That's fine. But you need to be able to use it for something. So let's click this Use My Token button. And what I've done is I've created a simple application sitting behind this service that's running on Kubernetes. And so at the moment, if I use without authentication, I can see that I'm connecting this application, I'm getting a 200 status OK. And so if I connect a couple of times, what I'm doing is I've got a load balanced service that's running behind this, secured with Istio, that's connecting to different applications and different services that are running behind it. So without authentication, that's working just fine at the moment. But the point of this is to create a secure application or a secure service. So how do we secure this service? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Cloud Shell. And let me quickly run this command. We'll give that 1 second to do its thing. Great. So let me quickly talk you through what this is doing. So what I've done is I've created a policy and I've named it CICP Jot. My target in this case is my Hello World application that's running on GKE. And what I've said is that I want to use origin authentication. I want to be able to support tokens that have been issued by my CICP project and then have a JWKS URI associated with the account that's signing that token. And so what this is going to do is it's going to force a user to be authenticated before they can even access my application. So that's a huge step forward. Suddenly my application is secure. It's only going to allow people that have authenticated with CICP. Now, I could get a little bit crazy here if I wanted to as well and go through and start setting RBAC policies. And so I could say, this policy is on for the applications that are configured for it. And for all services and for all methods, I'm going to require that the user has a role claim of admin. And so just as I set a role claim of guest, I could set a role claim of admin and block anyone from the service that didn't have that relevant level of authorization. And I can do all of this with Google Kubernetes Engine and Istio to ensure that I don't need to change my application when I change my authorization policies or anything like that. So we won't configure this authorization policy for now, but if we quickly flick back to my application, and this time if I try it again without authentication, what you can see is that I've got a response code 401. So I'm no longer authorized to access the application because I'm not using authentication. But if I hit the with authentication button, what you can see is I'm getting a 200 status OK, and I'm sending this token as part of my authorization headers. And so now, I'm authenticated to the application knows who I am, and I can get load balanced across these two services as I'm getting access. So that's really great. So let me sign out. And I'll quickly show you sort of what that looks like. So CICP is integrated across Google Cloud. I've typed in a username and password to get access to CICP, and it's issued me a token. I've taken that token and I've passed it through this ingress gateway, and it's load balancing across my two backend services that are running on Google Kubernetes Engine. And so it's forcing that authentication. It's forcing me to have authenticated before I get access to the app or service. And then I could add extra layers of authorization at the services that are running on GKE behind it. Great. So this product's currently in public beta. And we're positioning a general availability in the near term, but it'll be later in 2019. So if you want to find out more about this, head over to cloud.google.com/identity-cp. And please stay tuned for a live Q&A. We'll be back in less than a minute. Welcome back, everyone. It looks like we've got a bunch of questions from the audience, so let me get started with answering some of these. So the first one is, how does this differ from Firebase authentication? And it's a great question. Cloud Identity for customers and partners and Firebase authentication are achieving the same goals in a lot of ways. Firebase authentication is targeted at mobile app developers looking to build applications on top of Firebase and really add an authentication layer to get access to things like real-time database and Firestore. We heard from our customers that there is a need for cloud identity for customers and partners to enable our users that are building on top of Google and on top of Google Cloud to build world-class multi-tenant SaaS services and applications to secure API gateways and things like that. And so these two products are actually able to be used in conjunction with one another. I can use Firebase services with CICP, and if I'm a Firebase authentication user, I can start to get the benefits from some services in Google Cloud as well. And so we want to make sure that you have the right options, the right tooling for whatever your application or service you might be building is. The second question, how would you suggest securing connections between a front-end app and back-end services for anonymous users with Kubernetes Istio? So my demo that I gave you here is exactly that, Kubernetes and Istio. And so there's a couple of ways that you can do it, and I'd love you to reach out and we can dive into more details here. But what you can do is you can enable a user to come through the front door, through the ingress gateway, and say, you know what, they need to have had a token issued by CICP. So you can ensure that they are an anonymous user, they do have a token and things like that. But then when you get to an application or service, start to configure RBAC policies and policies that say, this has to be a named user. They can't have a sign-in method of anonymous or whatever the case is, and then offer them a really, really smooth progression to become a named user, to get an account, and then start to use your service. We find that, as I was saying at the start, that gentle onboarding of a user can enable them to adopt more of your service and reduce the friction through that initial period. How can I get started with CICP? This is my favorite question. If you're a Google Cloud Platform customer today, simply log in, go to the marketplace and search for CICP. If you're not, we do offer a pretty generous free trial of GCP, and so I'd certainly encourage you to go in there, get your free trial and start to use it. We are in beta, and I'd love to hear your feedback, and so we've got a bunch of different mechanisms you can relay feedback to us on our public documentation. What MFA factors do you support? So as we transition to general availability, we're going to support sort of the common ones that you might expect in the short term. So SMS-based authentication is something that, whilst it's not the most secure, it is meeting our customers where they are. It will enable them to start to be more secure than just a username and password or something like that. But we've got an incredible roadmap over the course of time to ensure that we offer really, really strong authentication factors. And we believe at Google that we can bring strong authentication like what Google does to the consumer market. And so stay tuned there, because I look forward to delivering a lot of that to you through the roadmap. The next question is, how does this differ from Google Cloud Identity and the product that exists known as Cloud Identity Premium? So that's a really interesting question. Cloud Identity is Google Cloud's umbrella term for managing identity. So whatever your identity needs are, we've got a solution for you. Whether it's Cloud Identity for your employees, Cloud Identity for your customers and partners, we believe that we have a solution that's right for your business. And so, Cloud Identity is really targeted at getting my employees access to devices, or securing their devices and getting them access to their applications. Whereas CICP is targeted at app developers building applications, building services, and having this authentication platform underneath that's tightly integrated with Google Cloud Identity. So if you're building a line of business application or something like that, these two things work really, really seamlessly together to enable you to have an amazing experience for your employees, partners, and customers. Does my app have to be hosted on Google Cloud is the next question, and most certainly it does not. This product is a customer identity and access management platform. We believe that, customers have different deployment options, they have different deployment needs, they have different security needs, and we want to encourage choice across the market. And so whether you're deployed in Google Cloud, whether you're deployed on-prem or in some other cloud provider, CICP works seamlessly across all those different pieces of functionality, or across all those different deployment models. One thing that's important is today I showed you sort of an example of GAE and GKE and Istio and things like that. And these, things like GKE can be deployed on-prem as well. And so if you did decide to use CICP, you still get that tight integration with GKE, even through different deployment models. And then the last question is, what tools can help me to migrate to CICP? And so we have an administrative SDK that works on all of the common frameworks and all the common languages that you'd expect. So things like Node.js and Python and Java and C++. And we offer tooling to enable you to migrate easily from your existing database or whatever the system might be into CICP. We also offer command line functionality to enable you to do that if that's more to your liking or something that you want to add to your deployment processes. So that's all of the questions. And that's it for me. So I'd love you to stay tuned for the next session, which is enabling BeyondCorp within your organization with context-aware access. Thank you so much for your time this morning.